All right, let's talk about the ways that we can adjust an if-then statement or the changes that we can make to it. So I have an example of an if-then statement. If you exercise, then you lose weight, and we've talked about in previous lessons the parts. The if part is called the hypothesis. Okay, that's our condition, and the then is the conclusion. Okay, so if the hypothesis happens, then the conclusion is true. And this is generally a true statement. If you exercise, then you will lose weight, I guess, as long as you don't eat extra food. Okay, so there are some things we can do to an if-then statement, some adjustments, changes that can be made, different forms. The first one we talk about is the converse. The converse takes your original statement and it switches the hypothesis and conclusion. So it switches the if and the then. So our original statement was if you exercise, then you lose weight. The converse would switch these two, okay? So that you're saying if you lose weight, then you exercise, okay? The second type, and you'll want to write these down and an example of them so you have them fresh as far as what each one does. It negates the hypothesis and conclusion, so they get to stay where they were originally, but we say negate means to say the opposite. So the opposite of exercising is not exercising. The opposite of losing weight is not losing weight. Okay, we don't get real fancy with it and say gaining weight. We just say you do not lose weight or you do not exercise. Okay, so this would be the inverse of our statement. If you do not exercise, then you do not lose weight. So notice exercising was at our beginning of our statement. Losing weight was at the end, just like our original. The only thing that changed is we negated both of them, made them the opposite. The final thing you can do with the statement is form the contrapositive, and it does both the converse and the inverse put together. It both negates them and it switches the hypothesis and conclusion. So losing weight is going to come at the first and exercising will come at the end. Okay, so the opposite of what it was up here. And also we negate them both, so we make them both the nots. So this time we have if you do not lose weight, then you do not exercise. So it's not real complicated, but you do need to know what each thing does, what a converse does to a statement, what an inverse does to a statement, and what a contrapositive does. So I would be sure and write that in my notes. Again, the converse switches the hypothesis and conclusion. The inverse negates the hypothesis and conclusion, but does not switch them. And the contrapositive does both. It negates the hypothesis and conclusion and switches them. All right, write the converse of each statement. Okay, if a figure has 6 sides, then it is a hexagon. So what do we do on a converse? And here's our second one. If I walk to school, then my feet hurt. Okay, so I have both of those. I have the answers on my next slide. Take a look at them. What do you think? What is the converse going to be for each of these statements? So remember what the converse does. Well, the converse switches the if and the then. So for this statement, it should move the figure has 6 sides to the end for the then, and it is a hexagon to the front as the if. And for walking to school, it should take the I walk to school and move it to the end as the conclusion, and the my feet hurt, move it to the front as my if. If we take a look at this next slide, notice that's exactly what we have. So the converse of the first statement would be, if it is a hexagon, then a figure has 6 sides. It switched the if and the then. And for the next one, the converse would be, if my feet hurt, then I walk to school. So the feet hurting comes to the front, the walking to school goes to the end. That is the converse. Again, switches the if and the then. All right, let's try to form an inverse. What would the inverse of this statement be? If you go to work, then you make money. So think about the inverse. What does the inverse do? Okay, so take a look at your notes, whatever you have written down, and hopefully you have written down that the inverse leaves the hypothesis and conclusion in the original order, but it negates them both, so it makes them both the opposite. So what's the opposite of going to work? is not going to work. So if you do not go to work, and the opposite here, what's the opposite of making money? Not making money. So you do not make money would go here. That would form our inverse. So which of those statements, A, B, C, or D, is the inverse? Let's take a look. It would be D. So again, the inverse leaves the hypothesis and conclusion where they were, but it negates them. It makes them the opposite. So the inverse would be if you do not go to work, down here at the bottom, sorry, if you do not go to work, then you do not make money. All right, here's one on the contrapositive. So again, take a look at your notes. What would the contrapositive for this statement be? If a figure has 3 sides, then it is a triangle. What does the contrapositive do? Well, hopefully you've written down that the contrapositive does both things. It switches the if and the then, so it moves the end, whoops, excuse me, hard time keeping track of my pen here. Here we go. The front to the end and the end to the front. And it also negates them. So the opposite of being a triangle is not being a triangle, and the opposite of having 3 sides is to not have 3 sides. Okay, so which of those statements, A, B, C, or D, is the contrapositive of our original statement? If a figure has 3 sides, then it is a triangle. It should be C, should be the answer you chose. If a figure is not a triangle, then it does not have 3 sides. So again, the contrapositive both switches and negates the hypothesis and conclusion. The front goes to the end comes to the front, and we make them both negations, or the opposite of what they said originally. Okay, let's try it, and we're going to throw in truth values here as we do this. So here's a statement: if an animal is a cat, then it has 2 ears. What's the truth value of that statement? Well, it's going to be true. Okay, and if an animal is a cat, then it does have 2 ears. Let's go ahead and form the converse of that statement. So again, what does the converse do? It switches the hypothesis and conclusion. So instead of the end comes to the front and the front goes to the end, leave the if and then where they are, however. Just move the other parts. So if it has 2 ears, comes to the front, then what happens? Then an animal is a cat. All right, what's the truth value of this statement? Is the converse true? If something has 2 ears, is it a cat? I would say that is false. I don't have 2 ears. Or I have 2 ears, sorry, and I am not a cat. You have 2 ears and you are not a cat. So that the truth value of that converse would be false, okay? Because not everything that has 2 ears is not automatically a cat. Let's form the inverse now. What does the inverse do to our original statement? Well, I hope you remember it leaves the if and then the hypothesis and conclusion where they were, but it negates both of them. So here we have if an animal is not a cat, opposite of being a cat would be to not be a cat, then it does not have 2 ears. That's the opposite of having 2 ears. Okay, what's the truth value? Is that true statement or a false statement? If an animal is not a cat, does it not have 2 ears? Well, once again, I am not a cat, but I do have 2 ears. Okay, so this one is also false. And finally, we have the contrapositive. Okay, so the contrapositive, what does it do? Remember, it switches the statements and it negates them. It does both things. So the having 2 ears will be at the front as our hypothesis. The being a cat will be at the end as our conclusion, and they will both be the opposite. So we will be if it does not have 2 ears, then an animal is not a cat. Okay, and what's the truth value of that statement? If something doesn't have 2 ears, does that mean it's not a cat? We're kind of hoping that we're going with just normal regular cats, not one that's had an accident or a birth defect. Okay, so this would be true. Okay, because we said that everything that is a cat has 2 ears. So if it doesn't have 2 ears, then it's not a cat. So the truth value of our contrapositive is true.